Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Ganan Adamu, and we are part of Setting the Story Straight, part of Savera UK. So I'm going to quickly run through some housekeeping for everyone. So chat is disabled for participants, but we'll be sharing information in the chat box throughout. A big one for us is no hate speech, no inappropriate language, and please be respectful. We'll also be using the Q&A box to submit questions. If you're unable to use the Q&A box, please raise your hands, and we have a couple of Savera UK staff members who will support you and talk you. We'll talk to you as well and let me know once you've raised your hands. And we'll be responding to the Q&A session later in the event. So if you have your question for someone specific, please indicate that as well. So include the person's name. Now, a brief introduction to the event running order will be, as you know, this is Setting the Story Straight. We'll be sharing the results of the survey. We'll have discussions with the survivors and professionals on the representation in media of HBA and harmful practices, survivors and affected communities. There'll also be a discussion around the issues with panel of journalists, survivors and professionals, followed by a Q&A. But I'd also like to introduce a quick introduction to our panelists today. Katra, can I start with you, please?
Hi, everyone. So my name's Katra Patterson. I am an FGM survivor. I'm also a mother of 2 boys. I have a business. I co-own a business and I'm a founder of KP Aesthetics. My background is that both my parents are Somali. I was brought up in a very abusive household. So as a young child from the age of 4 or 5, there was always violence around me, perpetrator being my father. So I was quite a fearful child growing up. Very hyper-vigilant child as well, hyper-vigilant towards my mother's emotions. I was cut at the age of 10, and that under the pretense of going on holiday. So that caused me a lot of emotional and psychological trauma growing up. I'm also dyslexic and dyscalculic. So I mention these things because growing up, it really hampered my life. Going through education in the late 70s, 80s, I was always a thick person, a thick child, a stupid child. So I mention this because I have a successful business now. Education wasn't easy for me. I am a nurse. I've been a nurse for 30 odd years. I left school with 2 O levels. And I did go on to further education. I have got a degree in public health now. I've also been a midwife and a health visitor. And for me, it could have been one or 2 ways. I think my abuse is a part of me. It's who I am, and it's driven me to be where I am today with my successful business. I employ 7 staff. I have a doctor and a plastic surgeon on board. So it's to show other people, really, sharing my stories, to show others that actually you can have adversity, you can have abuse. It doesn't have to define you. And I think being on board with Savera UK, it allows me to share my story. And I think through education, we can change these, what is it, the painful, practices that our communities put us through as women. And we can use the media. The media is a very useful vehicle to send out messages, to even change legislation. But the media has to portray these harmful practices in a better way than they do at times, and in a positive light, and not marginalised communities. So that's why I'm here today.
Thank you so much, Katra. Zuleika, can I come to you?
Hi, I'm Zuleika Sasser, and I'm a Savera UK ambassador and an arranged marriage survivor. I was brought up in quite a complex household where my dad was a practicing Muslim and my mother was an Irish Catholic, and then she converted from 10 years old onwards, and everything for me as the eldest girl changed a lot. And from there, obviously everything changed completely. And from 13 up, it was set that I had to start getting ready for arranged marriage. We were brought to a certain mosque, and there was a lot of conforming, and actually it was my mother who changed quite a lot. Actually, she became quite conformed, quite changed, and it was a very, very big shock really to myself, not so much to my brother. And at 16 I was pulled out of my A levels to have an arranged marriage to a 35-year-old Arab, after receiving a beating from my dad, to finally say yes to it. I, after 3 months, escaped. Unfortunately, I had to have the help from my grandmother, because I did attempt to take my life, but my grandmother intervened and took me out of hospital and looked after me for a little while on the Irish side. And from there, I then signed on to the job centre and got myself a little place, and actually got a job after 2 weeks at the job centre. And from there, which was quite amazing, I was 17 and was, as far as I was concerned, this was great. So I got on as an admin officer, and then from there I went on to get a job in the city in London, where they paid for me to do a HR degree. And then I got my first flat by the time I was 21, mortgaged flat, my car, and I worked very, very hard to create my own life. And yes, it was for me very amazing, because at one point I didn't want to be here. And then in my 30s, the whole thing changed, and I got spotted for fitting modelling, became a personal trainer, and I'm going back to that because I loved sport, absolutely loved sport. I ran for Surrey, that got taken away because it wasn't appropriate anymore, and now I'm back. I still do fitness modelling, I run my own health coach business, I'm a nutritionist, personal trainer, fitness model, have my own business. I now have 26 clients, and life can be wonderful, just got to push through it. And that's what I want to keep trying to project, this message to, especially people out there who are feeling very lost. So that's why I'm here.
Maya, you're up next.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me, and thank you both for bravely sharing your stories. Very emotional. So I'm a journalist, specifically the women's correspondent at The Independent, the only women's correspondent at a UK news outlet, which is a bit depressing, but yeah. So I write news, social policy, and global stories from a woman's angle, focusing on human rights, sexual violence, domestic abuse, abortion, prisons, health, poverty, and other issues. I've also written about honour-based abuse for The Independent a fair amount. This isn't an issue which gets a lot of coverage in the media, you know, let's be honest. In fact, I'd say there's a real shocking, troubling lack of coverage. I'll be touching on why I think this is the case later on in the discussion, as I'm sure our other panelists will too. But first, I think the best thing is to briefly recount some of the investigations and news stories I've done on honour-based abuse, as obviously that's relevant for this. So during the lockdown, I reported on the victims imprisoned at home as honour-based abuse reports surged in lockdown, honing in on figures which showed this rise. Well, last January, I wrote a piece which revealed the government was considering dropping references to honour-based abuse in the recording of crimes such as forced marriage, coercive control, and FGM, raising concerns that offences could then go undetected. And then last July, I wrote a piece about how quarantine hotel costs risked forced marriages essentially dying, victims dying in honour killings or being trapped abroad. So yeah, lovely to meet everyone today, and thank you for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
I can't wait for this discussion. It's going to be so powerful. Saliha?
Hi, yeah, my name is Salia Rashid. Really great to be here and to be on this panel. So just a brief introduction. I am a survivor of honour-based abuse. I come from a Pakistani background and I am also blind. So in terms of my campaigning work, because I'm a campaigner as well, I have a particular interest around disability and gender-based violence. And as we've heard, gender-based violence is something that isn't reported on very much, and particularly around minoritized women within that, so including disabled women is certainly something that doesn't get much awareness. But just a quick background. I was raised, as I said, in the Pakistani community. Growing up, I was always told that because I am blind and a woman, I couldn't have high aspirations or be independent. I made 3 attempts to leave behind those shackles of honor. The first 2, so the first time I left, I was 16, and I went into a refuge. And because of the lack of support and awareness, again, amongst statutory organisations, both around disability and gender-based violence and how those 2 kind of interlink, I wasn't given the support I needed, and I returned back. And similarly on the second occasion. But 10 years ago, I left for the last time. And since then, I started campaigning. I do a lot of campaigning work with organisations like Women's Aid, and I was recently invited to be on the advisory board for Savera UK. So thank you, Afra, and everyone else for having me.
Thank you so much, Salia. Today's event is very, very important, and I mean, I don't have to say that myself, but I really want everyone who's joined us to really listen with open hearts, open your ears, and there's a lot of information that might be triggering, but this is the reason why we're here. So any questions that you feel that maybe you might not be able to ask right now, or is something that you want to address later, Savera UK is there to handle that. So don't feel that you've got to ask the question today if it might be triggering. Please keep those questions and send them through to the Savera team after today's session. But really be open to some of the information that you might hear today from our survivors and ambassadors as well. I think I'll probably be triggered, as I've been with Savera for so many years, but the information that I hear it still gets me, so I know how I'm feeling. We haven't even started. But I want to welcome Afra Kasim, who is co-founder of Savera, and she'll take it away.
Thanks, Gunan. Good afternoon, everyone. For those who doesn't know me, my name is Afra Kasim, and just recently 2 years ago, just joined and became the CEO, but I have been the founder of Savera UK, so established it. And my background is I've worked in the NHS, did various roles within the NHS and around inequalities, improving inequalities, particularly for Black minority communities, and through those roles and engagement with communities and professional, particularly in this area, I really wanted to, I think at the earliest stages, wanted to kind of find out the impact of domestic abuse and mental health and how it's impacted mental health, and through the engagement with communities and professionals, find there is a huge gap in services understanding the issue of domestic abuse, particularly when it comes from a cultural specific abuse, how fear the communities of asking for help or going for help because they felt that they are not going to be understood. They felt that their children might be taken away. They felt that it's shame and it's guilt that if they seek help, but also professional was fear of stereotyping, fear of discrimination, fear not able to understand what is those issues. It took us a long time, and we still do to this day, is having to really differentiate between what is actually arranged marriage and what is actually forced marriage, and how we ask the right questions and when can we ask for help. So I think those is the area. And then when particularly came to me, I come from a community where these issues existed, and I really wanted to make a difference. I didn't know how, I didn't know where to go, but you know, through the work that I had the opportunities to develop those areas, but particularly got more to me that I needed to act and I needed to do something is after I was requested to work with a group of particularly young women around, they had some questions about their culture and about their marriage, and they felt that their family being kind of really pressurizing them to say that you need by the age of 15, 16, you have to leave your school, you're not able to do it. If you don't really do well at school, this is what's going to happen to you. And some of them, you know, they didn't want to go to university, they didn't want to it's more of about what the choices that they've been given, rather than actually they make the choices. And they knew that they said, you know, we accept that we're going to get married, it's not our choice, but we do not want to do it at the age of 14, 15. We want to leave our teenage years, we want to kind of be with our friends, and I think that's what got me more. And I wanted to find some support for them, and there was none support for them, and I really made it my obligation to really support those women, and I worked with them just to be a listening ear, because it wasn't part of my job. It just, I needed to do something to support them and be there to answer their questions. So that's the reason, through those work and through the consulting engagement, that will become apparent that there is a need here in Merseyside that I needed to do. So that's when Savera, it started with Savera Liverpool in 2010. But then the surrounding area really got into the issue, and they really wanted to understand more. And then in 2016, we rebranded into Savera UK, which it becomes working across Merseyside and Cheshire, but also national as well. So the current organisation of Savera UK, it's the aim of it, it's to tackle cultural specific abuse across the UK, and that will include honor-based abuse, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and any other harmful practices from a cultural specific that identify or kind of being justified out their culture as their issues. And within our services, we provide the one-to-one support team and advocacy for those who's at risk of honor-based abuse or under threat of honor-based abuse. And then the main as well part of as well is to around campaigning and around kind of engagement. The more we engage and raise awareness, hopefully those stereotypes will be broken, and event like this and ours going to the communities is so vital, is so important. The more we talk about it, the more we kind of say this is not a hidden subject, this is not it's a shame to talk about it. We need to talk about it so people really understand what these issues are, and understanding the different, what is harmful practices and what is actually our culture that we need to celebrate, because a lot of confusion, and that's what Savera's aim is about, to have that understanding that culture is our identity, culture is our where we come from, is our celebration of who we are, but harmful practices is against a human right. There is nothing, it does not relate to our culture, it's just how historically has been, and we need to really break that stereotype, that kind of stigmatize of kind of telling, oh, it's their culture, that's how they justify it. And hopefully through our campaign, through our work, that's what we do. But also most importantly, we want to understand those issues a bit better. So part of the work that we do is around that evidence-based research. We've kind of started doing that work, and I think the more we understand it through research, through evidence, will help us not just being able to provide better support, but also change service provision shades appropriate to how we tackle those issues. So today's story getting the Story Right project, it started a kind of very similar how Savera started. It started kind of through discussion, through ideas, kind of talking to our ambassadors, survivors, of how the media kind of sometimes that kind of betrayed them, or also survivors kind of our survivors kind of saying why they don't want to speak with media because of how they betrayed their stories, how the story is in the media, how they sometimes the head title of it makes you kind of fear, and when you read and you just think, oh my god, why is that? So I think those kind of important, but as an organization we really understand the media coverage and how important it is that we work with the media to help us raise those awareness and tackle those awareness, because if we don't, like social media, like others, it's really important for us. But it's how we work together, how we ensure that we really understand those issues. And we have been really fortunate to get that support of funding from our Lloyds Bank Foundation through their Small Change Fund to explore those ideas. And what the project was intended is to find how other professionals and survivors felt about the representative and the engagement. Also, it's about identifying that gap, also identifying about the information of journalists need to make their job easier. It's creating kind of helpfully guidelines for media to try kind of address those issues, and ultimately kind of represent a really positive kind of information that people really understand and really work and how it is. So in now, but at the same time, we also understand that these issues are really complex, these areas, and we really understand, the media understand that sometimes they come to us and they want the information like the following day. And this is not that easy with clients that we work with. We have to make sure that they understand what their involvement is. We need to explain the risk, the safety. They wouldn't understand how their story is going to be told, what the support afterwards, all those kind of things that we have. So sometimes the minute we get media kind of involved and they wonder, it kind of really worry us, and we kind of sometimes we kind of saying, oh no, we can't do it. It's how can we try to work together really to bring those issues into the limelight by ensuring that those who tell their stories are really safe and are really supported way. So we're really great. So, but before I go into where we're going to find out the findings from our survey that we have done, which is a small starting point to survey, which Nikki will go through that. I've got really great pleasure to introduce Rachel from Lloyds Bank to just say about the fund and how they really kind of help to support that. So Rachel, down to you.
Thanks, Afra. So I'm Rachel. I work in the policy team at Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. We support lots of small local charities across England and Wales who are supporting people facing issues like domestic abuse, sexual violence, homelessness, mental health. And we're really pleased to support this really important project at Savera. Alongside kind of providing funding and development support for charities, one of our core goals is to work with charities to influence change in policy and practice at a kind of systemic or strategic level. We know that charities like Savera have such a huge amount of expertise and evidence and insights from the communities that they work with that could have a really valuable impact on influencing policy and practice, and we want to be able to support and amplify those voices at a broader level. And we also know that charities like Savera already have the ideas about what needs to change. It's just having that time and resource and capacity to be able to put it into action when you're so focused on kind of doing the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. And that's where our kind of Small Change Fund came from, was it's a chance to provide a bit of extra capacity to put those ideas into action. So when Savera came to us with the idea for this project, we were just really pleased to be able to support it, particularly given the emphasis on survivors speaking up and using their own experiences and voices to campaign, as well as bringing in journalists and other connections in the media to make sure that these issues are properly heard and represented. The media has so much power over how issues are understood and perceived, and so it's a real opportunity for this project to kind of fill that gap and change representation led by survivors who know it best. So thank you for having me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussion.
Just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Nikki Croft-Gervin and I am the PR manager for Savera UK. Started off as a volunteer helping out, and somehow Afra convinced me to to stay. So I don't know, the best decision ever. But as I've worked in comms for a long time now, but my background's actually in journalism. I was a journalist for 10 years, specifically working in true life journalism, so working directly with people's stories. And so when this sort of came up, as Afra mentioned before, alluding to the discussion, I think it was one of our 2020 panel events, it came up, and obviously it's really important to me because I feel like probably in my younger journalist years I wasn't aware of the impacts potentially of not looking after my case studies or my interviewees in the same way. So basically, as Afra has mentioned, the aim of this entire project is to ultimately create some really useful media guidelines that are co-created by our survivors professionals and also with the input of the media. We want to identify these particular surveys that I'm going to take you through now, were results from survivors and professionals working with survivors of HBA and harmful practices. The intention being that we identified the gaps and the issues. We didn't want to assume, we know working at Savera what kind of things come up, but we wanted to put it out wider and make sure we weren't just assuming the issues and if there was others that we didn't necessarily expect. So I'm going to start with the survivor responses. Question was posed to our survivors, asking, did they think that the UK media represented survivors and the communities affected by HBA and harmful practices as well? So we want to know is, do they see themselves and do they see their communities reflected? 55% strongly disagreed that they saw people like themselves represented in the media. 82% felt that the UK does not do a good job of representing survivors of HBA and harmful practices, and 64% felt it didn't do a good job of representing the issues or the affected communities. So that was obviously quite a stark initial result. However, when we asked them if they would be interviewed by a journalist, 55% said yes. And the reasons behind it, I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. I think it's an important topic to raise awareness on. Although I'm not always happy with how my story is told, I still try my best. I would be happy to talk to a journalist to give a fair representation of the community. So those 2 points really show the importance of raising these issues. You know, as Maya's alluded, and as Catherine Salirova said, it's not very frequently represented. So any opportunity to get messaging out there is very important to survivors and people, particularly the people who've come through it and are wanting to offer hope to others. The others who said yes, and there was quite a lot. Obviously, we haven't put all the quotes from all the responses in here, and we will be sharing some more details at a later date. But there were people who said yes, but with caveats, and these are really understandable things. That yes, but I would need control of the final edit. Now, I know Myra will have some thoughts on that because that's a different kind of thing which we'll come to later. But I think that controlling the story because of the risk, and if my identity is not revealed as well. So the security issues. Of the people that said they didn't know or said no, there was 45%. Some said, I don't trust the media. Like most people, I simply wouldn't trust the journalist. Now, those two, I think, are definitely not just on a based abuse and harmful practices issue. That's a wider issue. And I think it's possibly one that is a problem with specific sectors of the media that people sort of tar with the same brush. But it's an understandable one. It is one that came up quite a lot. And then again, the other thing was safety considerations and considerations. So I don't know how anonymous the interview will be. So there are sort of initial points there. We spoke to our survivors who had spoken to journalists, who had been interviewed previously, and that had a really mixed sort of different mixed experiences. 45% had been interviewed before. Of those, 60% felt the interviewer didn't have a good understanding of HBA and harmful practices or the impact that sharing a story would have. It wasn't always necessarily a direct criticism, although in some cases it was, but it was just that there was a lack of understanding anyway, so it was kind of almost expected with some of the notes that came through. 80% said that no aftercare was put in place for them after the interview. And I think this particular quote is quite striking. It says, "I've cried in many interviews, but once I leave the room, no one even asks me if I'm okay." Now, that's obviously something that came up in different formats throughout the responses from survivors. That said, we know that there's a bit of a pace in journalism. There's churn of deadlines. And actually, I think, you know, sometimes that there's a lack of understanding from our side on that point of things. Going through to the professional responses. So these are people like social services, support workers, specialist services, and individuals who work with survivors. Again, the question about whether the coverage of HBA and harmful practice in UK media reflects the scale of the problem. And I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. 96% believe it does not represent the scale of the problem. And I think that's reflected in many different ways. 77% disagreed or strongly disagreed that the media demonstrated a good understanding of these issues. And 92% thought that representative people and communities affected it was inaccurate. The problem with stereotyping came up quite a lot throughout the survey comments. So again, it kind of mirrors some of the feedback from the survivors. Only 4% of the respondents believed that UK journalists were well equipped to identify people at risk or seek or signpost to help. Now, on reflection, when we've looked at this question again, and actually a lot of the responses that came through were basically indicating that it's not actually the job of a journalist to be able to identify risk, but the better signposting could help them in their job and in their kind of working together with organisations. There's a couple of quotes here. There's a lack of knowledge that's evident between services just in local authorities and third sector. So we have to assume there's even more lack of knowledge within journalism, you know, acknowledging the fact that this isn't a journalist's day-to-day job and it's not what they should. And if there's lack of knowledge and understanding in our own sector, how can we expect it to be different outside that sector? Another point that came up was they are interested in the hype around the story, not the true impact of such practices. So the sensational headlines, as I think someone mentioned before, like the headline, why is it like that? And the lack of sometimes feeling that when a story is being told, the impact of the act and the potential help that people get isn't in there. Was quite a bit of acknowledgement about how far things have come though within the responses, and that there are journalists, responsible journalists, that are trying really hard to get it right. And one quote that came out was, "I feel awareness has improved and that responsible journalists would know how to seek help for survivors or promote these channels through their media." So again, it's, you know, as the issue itself has become more, there's been more awareness around the issue generally, as Afra said, for, you know, years ago when we started Savera Liverpool, there was little understanding of why there was a need for such a service as Savera UK. But obviously now it's recognising we help many people. So the awareness is increasing, and that's a positive thing. And that is because of the work of journalists who are, I say, working responsibly and, you know, and with organisations like ourselves. We asked some questions around reporting techniques used by journalists. So these involve things like door knocks, using interpreters, interviewing community members and family about stories that they're working on. And 69% thought that these techniques, these obviously very traditional reporting techniques, put individuals at greater risk of honour-based abuse. Few comments made were that communities affected by HBA are stigmatised for discussing personal matters outside the community, and if they are caught doing so, it can lead to repercussions. Plays on stereotypes could make communities feel more victimised. People may not be able to speak openly in front of others from their communities. And again, as a positive side of this and working and advocate for working together, I think if this is done well and by building trust within communities, you can really make a difference. It's about creating a strategic approach of empowerment rather than blame and shame. Stereotypes was something that came up a great deal throughout both surveys. 65% thought the UK media reinforced negative stereotypes about HBA and harmful practices and the communities affected by them. And some of the points that were raised here said that negative coverage, inaccurate reporting and negative stereotypes have a negative impact on victims and survivors. Another thing with the stereotype was just very generally people, it's not always reflected that on HBA and harmful practice affected a wide range of people, and that it's something that can affect people of all ages, genders and backgrounds. So by way of a summary, the key issues that have been raised from the side of professionals and the survivors as the main issues or the main gaps that we need to address within these guidelines that we hope to create are reinforcing those negative stereotypes of communities, stereotyping survivors by not highlighting that it affects all genders, ages and backgrounds, a lack of understanding of the issues, which is creating risk and it's not communicating stories accurately or most effectively, lack of care and support for survivor interviewees, and sensationalizing stories around HBA and harmful practices. There was one response we got here that I put at the bottom there, really, just because I think it quite nicely encapsulates what we're trying to do with this project and the point of this exercise, that HBA and harmful practices working to eradicate them as we all are, as grassroots and sort of services. It's an incredibly complex and difficult situation. We should collaborate with grassroots organisations to gather good information and to recruit people to interview. Try connecting with people's stories and do not to refer to them as victims. Representing a person's story as it is, without creating waves of hate, is successful journalism. And I think that's a really nice point to end on from the actual the feedback that we got in the surveys. Just by way of sort of updating on how, because this has been a project that's been going on for quite some time, it's got a lot of time sort of working on things, and our next step is to circulate a media survey. What we want to make sure we do is we now ask media what will be useful for them, what do you need to know, what can we give you and what can we support with as organisations. So we want to circulate that and get that feedback, so we've heard from all sides. We will be developing the guidelines alongside all groups, those three groups. We're going to be working with IPSO, who are going to give us a bit of support on creating those guidelines effectively and sort of launching them. And we aim to, hopefully, all being well, launch in line with the Day of Memory 2022, which is a day of remembrance for those who have been lost to honour-based abuse, which is on the 14th of July. So that is, I think, the brief summary. Thank you again to Lloyd Frank and Rachel's team for helping us do this project. It came together out of a little conversation in another event and getting it to this point. And I'll hand back to Gunnar.
Thank you so much, Nikki. It's crazy because obviously working in the media industry, you would think this is common sense, isn't it? But actually, they always say common sense isn't common. But it's so, all that survey, it makes me think a lot more about how I deal with sensitive topics and how I deal with contributors as well, and listening. And I say that, and that's why I keep on saying we always have to listen to each other. So we're going to have a discussion now with our panelists. So if everyone can unmute themselves. So it's going to be an in-depth discussion, and then we'll be inviting audiences to put their questions in the Q&A box as well. So yes, let me get some questions together. So Katra, again, I want to start with you. So the survey responses suggested that journalists interviewing survivors have a lack of understanding around the issues and also fail to understand the impact on survivors. So what has been your personal experience of this and in telling your story?
Okay, so I was triggered, I think, in 2019 with that first conviction that had occurred for FGM, and I told my story because I thought, you know, that speaking about what had gone, speaking candidly about what happened to me would just help to raise awareness. What I did find is that the questioning techniques of the journalists, that they had little understanding, or they hadn't researched the subject enough for themselves. So I'd be asked like really personal questions that, you know, can I reach an orgasm? You know, what is my sexual relationship experiences with my husband? And I just, these very intrusive questions, I just felt weren't, you know, weren't appropriate. The other thing that I found was it opened up a can of worms for me. You know, it's put me back to being that 10-year-old child. I was more than happy to share my story, but what I was ill prepared for was the outcome of sharing my story. I had, you know, it went worldwide. I had people contacting me from New Zealand, Congo, America, that had gone through their own personal sort of issues regarding harmful practices and FGM. I was dealing with my own trauma that I'd locked away for 40 years. And then to try and take on other people's traumas was really, really hard. So I felt that I was ill prepared. There was no aftercare. The initial story, when it went out, the title of it, I felt quite okay with it. But then within 2 hours, you know, that title had been changed to quite a traumatic. I can't even, let me bring it. Sorry, I had to screenshot it because I couldn't remember being menopausal. I just couldn't remember the title. So it said, schoolgirl thought she was going on holiday, but instead became an FGM victim. I was okay with that, you know. But then within a couple of hours, my parents said I was going on holiday, but I was taken away to be butchered, you know. And my mum thought she was doing the right thing, you know, for me. She was doing the right thing. She'd gone through it herself. So, yeah, it traumatized me. There was no aftercare. Journalists contacting me through Twitter, through Messenger, wanting to sort of get on the back of that. And I just, yeah, it had me spiraling, really spiraling. It took me to a dark place. Would I have done it again? I think, you know, I would do it now. Obviously, I'm sharing my story now, but I'm in a better place. I'm stronger. I have much more understanding. But the actual, I think it was me that said about the editing, you know, if we could have control of what goes out, final say so. I think the way it's portrayed is it's sensationalizing, it's marginalizing communities. That's how I felt. Yes, it is abuse, it is child abuse, but my mother wasn't, you know, coming from that place. She was protecting my future. You know, I had men contacting me going, what about circumcision? You know, that's barbaric. So, yeah, I think balance is needed. That's the other thing for me. You know, UK did harmful practices many years ago. You know, a woman couldn't have a hysterectomy without a husband's signature. When I say harmful practices, women didn't have a say in how to control their bodies. A woman couldn't open her own bank account without her husband counter signing as well. So, you know, our bodies are being controlled. But yeah, for me, it's what's portrayed out there. It needs to be balanced. You know, it's not just something that comes from Africa. It's not something that Muslims practice. You know, there's Christian white communities that practice FGM, you know, for women that they feel masturbate, they cut off the clitoris, you know. So there has to be a balance and not just stereotype it to one community, one group of people.
Would you say then that for anyone who wants to share their story, you should research the journalist or research the publication that shares that they share their story with.
Yeah, the outlets, you know, the journalists, what their previous stories have been, what they've put out there. I was completely naive, you know. I was just very keen to just show people, yeah, there's people on your doorstep in very, you know, I live in Cheshire, very, you know, very nice suburb of Cheshire, and there's nothing outwardly that shows people that I've gone through that trauma, and I just wanted to raise my story and educate people, but it did take me to a dark place.
Zulika, can I come to you? So as a survivor who has recently started speaking out about your experience, and one whose story is very different to those often seen in media, how do you feel about the way forced marriage survivors are represented, and why do you think it's important to share your story, and what concerns do you have?
I think my concerns have been it's not represented in a fair manner, in a fair way. You see what they would say a typical Muslim household is, a typical mum and dad, a typical scenario. I mean, even prime example, when my mum converted, you know, people who'd never met my mum were like, oh, it's because we came from a very secluded little village, and they'd be like, oh, is your mum wearing a sari, da, 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 da. And then obviously she's Irish, red hair, green eyes, white, you know, it's like, that's you see, that is the thing that to me is not represented. You know, when we went to this certain mosque, there were a lot of converts and a lot of parents arranging marriages for their daughters, and it was very a very English thing, actually. A lot of English converting. It was just an Irish thing. It was very, so again, you just don't see a lot of that representation going on. And so when I talk about my story, because it was my mum who was actually more in the forefront for change in our house than actually my dad, and yet the whole onus of the whole thing that happened was on my dad. And even now when I talk about it, it's like, oh well, your dad was, you know, my dad, you know, he did what he did when he, you know, did what he did, but I think it came from a place of stress, to be honest, actually. And actually it was my dad, I think, if he put his hand on his heart, was actually not wanting his daughter to have an arranged marriage. So it's completely the opposite, you know, of what is represented out there, you know, and that's why I feel like it's got to change. It's got to change, this whole different viewpoint on your typical head, you know, someone's wearing a headscarf, this is what it looks like, this is what they do, and it's like, no, or a beard, you know. And again, it's for me, enough's enough, because it's stories like mine, which there were plenty of in this mosque, that are hidden away because of what people look like, or not look like. So, and that to me, it was really wrong.
And that's so true. My mother's family are Christian, and my dad's family are Muslim. But actually my grandma, you know, on my mum's side, who's Christian, was married, had an arranged marriage with my granddad. She was 13 and my granddad was 21, you know, and that's a Christian family. And I think, and like you said, you know, people have this stereotype of what an arranged marriage, well, a forced marriage looks like, because the media unfortunately portrays it to be a Muslim situation, rather than actually all religions have forced marriages in some capacity. So yeah, Maya, can I come to you? So
yeah, sure.
You know, what's been your experiences of reporting HBA and harmful practices being like, and what challenges have you faced, and more broadly, what challenges do you think journalists, when reporting on these issues, face? And it's a long question, and what do you think are the barriers to better representation? So there's a lot there.
Yeah, okay, I don't know where to start. No, it's been really interesting so far. I mean, just to say, I would always do a read back if I, interview a survivor. I'm not going to lie, if I interview a politician, a celebrity, I don't call back and check the quote with them when they've absolutely put their foot in it. But it's completely different with a survivor of domestic abuse, of honour-based abuse, or anyone who's got kind of legal proceedings ongoing, because what's printed could harm their legal proceedings. And also, most importantly, with honour-based abuse, as is with, sexual violence, domestic abuse, if you don't read it back to them, or if I will read back on the phone, because that's what I've always been taught by editors, because otherwise, if you send them the article, then you can't make the source the editor from a journalistic perspective. But yeah, I mean, if you don't properly anonymize them, then, their life is essentially at risk. You don't want to have that, on you. So I think it is really important, but I don't really know what other journalists do. Journalism is quite a lone wolf profession, so I don't know what other journalists do. But yeah, I don't think everyone does a read back. So yeah, other issues with reporting. The survey results are really interesting, by the way. I think that there is I'll focus on the real lack of journalists reporting on honour-based abuse. That is also partly, to do with editors too. It's the whole newsroom environment. Why do I think this is? I think it's partly to do with the ongoing lack of diversity within journalism in the UK. So I'm just going to give some stats from an interesting recent report by the National Council for the Training of Journalists. They found the proportion of editors from non-white ethnic backgrounds is a meagre 10% compared to 14% in junior roles. So, that's still nothing. Editors obviously have a big impact on the news agenda. Like I said, the same study found 87% of journalists are white and overwhelmingly middle class. So it probably sounds very hypocritical for me to sit here and say this is a white woman, but, I'm actually not your average journalist. I went to, a mixed comprehensive school. I come from a mixed background, one grandma Jamaican Lebanese, another grandma German Jewish, another granddad from New Zealand. So yeah, I think the media, not all of the media, and things are slowly getting better, very slowly I may add. So it's not all the media, no, but as in the media, yeah, it's just not diverse enough. It doesn't represent victims of honour-based abuse. But I think, yes, so some of the things I've learned from reporting on honour-based abuse, obviously that's involved a lot of interviews with frontline workers, with survivors themselves. So, that's credit to them for teaching me this. Yeah, I've just been struck by the deep, deep ignorance of many working in public agencies, namely the police, social services, healthcare staff, teaching staff, of honour-based abuse. They often don't want to engage with the issues for fear of being perceived as racist, culturally insensitive. So then they just overlook it. And then essentially perpetrators operate with impunity. They also fail, I think this was touched on before, I was going to make this point, but someone else did. They also fail to ask victims the right questions, and then they don't pick up on the right signals. And then I've also been informed about issues around authorities being duped by relatives who deny they're perpetrating honour-based abuse. Why do I think this is? I think it's probably linked with the fact that domestic abuse historically was seen as a private issue. Just leave them to it. It's also been kind of construed as a kind of crime of frenzied passion. And I'd say that there's parallels with honour-based abuse, but even more so because it's family members. So people just think, I don't want to get involved. And then it's just allowed to occur. So I think, it's a complex, nuanced thing. And then the media often doesn't, as a journalist, or you don't often write the headlines. So, when people come and attack journalists on Twitter for the headlines, it's not, often their responsibility. The final say with headlines is the editors. But I think journalism is about simplifying stuff and portraying messages in high impact, ways. And that's powerful, but then, the flip side of it and, the adverse consequences is it's, it can be heavily reductive, simplistic, and so that is obviously not ideal, but you also do need to simplify stuff as a journalist, but you also need to do it in a sensitive, nuanced way. Obviously, this doesn't always happen. Yeah,
and I totally agree. I think, as journalists, a lot of our role is to understand communities. And I think as time has moved along, a lot of journalists want quick stories. You know, it's churning out those quick stories rather than actually, we need to immerse ourselves in community so we fully understand what's going on. We know how to deal with them. We know how to deal with sensitive issues. So a lot of it is background as well. I know when I first started working with Savera, and I was keen to get them on the early, like the breakfast show and the mid-morning show, to talk about FGM. And someone actually said, oh, I don't think anyone wants to hear that while they're eating a bowl of cereal. And I was like, well, actually, that's the most important time, because there's a child or there's someone there who's actively listening, and that could be a matter of life or death, you know. But because that person has never experienced or hasn't mixed in certain settings, they just didn't understand what it all meant and how to even frame it, even when I was trying to talk about how we could treat the story. So a lot of it comes from lack of education and lack of association with individuals as well. But like you said, you know, the newsroom on all platforms has to be diverse, and we have to encourage more people to really listen to different communities. Sally, I want to come to you next. So you've also had experiences with media as both a survivor and a campaigner. So can you tell us a bit about it and what you think the media can do to make survivor engagement more meaningful?
Yes. So as I mentioned before, I've been kind of campaigning for probably just after I left my abusive situation, and I think, as somebody mentioned before, when I started off with the media, you know, I wasn't, you know, fully aware kind of the implications of that. And it was very interesting actually, because when I graduated, so I graduated with a first class honours in psychology, and so at the graduation there was lots of local media who were there at the ceremony, in terms of like kind of television and the newspapers and all that kind of thing. And I agreed to it because I thought it would raise awareness of honour-based abuse. And actually, I think there was a lot of interest in my story as a disabled woman, and kind of the stereotypes or the assumption and misconceptions that are based on stereotypes of disabled people. So, you know, the fact that we're not capable, and the fact that, you know, I achieved a university degree meant that, you know, I'd overcome adversity, and all this, rather than kind of looking at the honour-based abuse side of things and the impact of that. And I think that's really important, because the stereotypes that the media has kind of perpetuates the public view of disability, which then in turn how we're viewed by society as a whole. And when that kind of interlinks with honour-based abuse, I think journalists are not very aware. And I think that, as we've mentioned, they've got kind of their misconceptions of communities, you know, based on their stereotypes. So, for example, with me, often journalists wrote that I escaped a forced marriage, which was incorrect, because I didn't experience that, but because of their kind of sort of preconceived ideas, that's what they thought. And also, I think as I continued kind of my campaigning journey, I started to also realize how kind of communities were alienated, and how honour-based abuse issues like forced marriage and honour-based abuse were framed as a cultural or religious practice, which also then feeds into kind of Islamophobic and racist attitudes that we have. And I think it should be very clear amongst everybody, including journalists, that these harmful practices, they're not rooted in culture or religion. They are abusive, and they should be framed as abuse. And I think something else I wanted to mention was around collusion with the perpetrator. So I think a lot of journalists, when they got my story, and they loved it because it would sell headlines, because, you know, I was this poor disabled woman who managed to then escape, and I managed to somehow get myself these university degrees and all the rest of it. But when they were contacted by my family and asked to withdraw those stories, they did. So there would be my family members who would contact them and tell them that I was lying about my experiences. And I have had at least 2, 3, if not more, media kind of media things pulled, including a documentary around honour-based abuse. And that is actually quite serious, because the nature of these harmful practices is that these practices are perpetrated to silence us and to make sure that we do not have a voice or a view. And so when the media decides to pull stories or cancel stories because the perpetrators of that abuse have asked them to, then they're colluding with the perpetrator, and they are further silencing us as well.
Maya, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it was just that I do agree with you, but just from a journalistic perspective, sometimes stories get pulled because then they're litigious, they're defamatory. It means that if you publish them, then the paper gets sued. So you know, that's why stories get pulled sometimes and killed. Obviously, I know why that would be awful for you, but as in the media doesn't want to publish things that means that then they're hit with a massive lawsuit.
Yeah. But that also, the risk of that also is that victims become silenced, because if we then have perpetrators who are saying, well, actually, if you contact the media, the story will get pulled, then that is really problematic on a wider level. And in terms of kind of a defamation, you know, they're kind of aware of these things, and I've never named perpetrators or identified them. I always speak about a community as a whole. So I think that is something that needs to be
well, if you haven't named them, then they shouldn't, you know, they shouldn't be identifiable. So it sounds like maybe they've been pulled for another reason, you know, rather than a legal one. So my point is not valid, so sorry. Yeah.
No, I think sometimes as well, you know, it's the interesting thing is a lot of perpetrators know how to talk the language. So when we in the media industry, we do get a lot of emails and letters, you know, about, oh, you can't say this, even though they haven't been named. They'll say, so we call it the jigsaw effect. They'll say, well, they said A, B, and C, which more or less points to me, you know. So there's this, and it's annoying because there's so many stories that, you know, sometimes if it's in the public's interest, then we have to run it. But then you're fighting with what could be a possible legal battle as well. Nikki, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so interestingly, just one of the things that I didn't include in the presentation, but did come out in the survey very specifically, was the fact that it was around stereotyping and saying how these acts were perpetrated by all different kinds of people high up in professions with a lot of power. You know, they're well integrated, I think the phrase was used, and with the power to be able to go to places and sort of like have their push their way, I think, which is kind of ties in with what Sally was saying. And I think it kind of is with survivors, you know, obviously can feel or being led to feel that they're in a weakened position because they maybe don't have the same voice or same, you know, and I think that's an issue. But it did come out in the survey as well, that lack of understanding that people who perpetrate can look like these people who can come very respectably and go, please don't, you can't say that because look at me, this is about me, you know. I think that came out quite in a few statements from the survey as well.
So
I think and I think it's okay. I think it's also worth remembering that we have stereotypes of who perpetrators might be as well, and a lot of perpetrators of these practices, you know, they're not what you might stereotypically find them to be. There's a lot of perpetrators who hold positions of power, you know, and standing in the community and things like that. And that is also something to bear in mind. And I think another point that I wanted to also make was kind of around justification of perpetrators' actions. So there's many a times where I have been asked by journalists and even on the radio that were your family not just being overprotective and trying to care for you because of your disability. And again, that is problematic because of the reasons that I've mentioned. And I think it's also being kind of being mindful of that as well. Yeah. I don't think we've got enough time, so I'll stop there.
I think one of the hardest things when listening to a lot of these stories and working in media is sometimes when I do speak to women who've gone through this, it's, you know, you love your country, you love where you come from, and if you find that you, on one hand, you know, being interviewed, you're not saying it's the community, you're not saying it's that country, you're saying there's some people that still practice this harmful practice, but actually if this was taken away, it would be a beautiful culture. It would be, you know, so it's like you're defending. I mean, it's a classic abusive relationship, isn't it? You know, you're defending at the same time as trying to protect yourself, but also trying to create this kind of invisible PR machine that's embedded in your head, because you just don't want society to think that, you know, that you're saying that your country or your culture is bad. It's just that your experiences of what you've been through has been harmful. So do you find that is that quite damaging for your mental health as well? I want to come to you, Zulika.
Sorry. Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, I was saying, do you find that when you're talking about your experiences, is it a case of talking about your experiences but still trying to protect the country that, you know, your family comes from, and not saying that that's not a bad country, it's just what you've been through is being a harmful practice?
Yes, yeah, that's probably why it's taken me a long time to speak up, to be honest, because I do feel I'm betraying something that I actually find. I've read the Quran, I've read the Bible, and I actually think some of it's so beautiful, and I'm so proud to be who I am, actually. And that's what makes me sad, because you do feel you can't speak up because it is portrayed in such a quite an unhelpful manner. So, and it is put, as you said before, about the typical stereotype boxes, and you don't want to be that stereotype. You just don't. So you're in this like little battle with yourself where you want to speak up, you want to help, but you also feel you're that typical stereotype image, which, you know, and especially I do love my culture, I do love my background. I actually think this, like I said, there's parts of it, if you're educated in it, then you'll absolutely know that this is completely a separate issue from religion. Yeah, it's quite plain as day as that, but unfortunately I think it's played a lot, especially in the Western culture and the Western world, as a different version of something that just does not exist, actually.
And that's a lesson for us in the media, to make sure that we separate that.
Yes.
Yeah. Afra, can I come to you?
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly. I think from Savera's point of view, and that's why we're trying to work around, differentiate between what is culture that we need to be part of, that it's our traditional arts, because it doesn't mean just somebody who escaped this violence, it has disregarded their culture or their belief, but actually it's because it's between life and death. And majority of what comes is between, they have no other way of survival in that environment, and I think really the society need to understand the difference between this kind of abuse, that being seen or justify, oh, it's our culture, it's our belief, it's our religion, where it's actually nothing to do with that. It's an abuse, that we need to recognize it, and we need to change that attitude and that behavior of how they are two different things. And I think it's really challenging. From our point of view, people still doesn't seem to get it. And I think working with the media and media reporting it in a way that it shows those different, hopefully will play a huge difference as well.
You know what I love about working with Savera is, even though, you know, I come from media, you guys are so strict with me. So even when I work with your ladies, it's like, don't do this, make sure you don't say that, leave that out, send us and I think, and it reminds me, you know, of the important work that you guys are doing. You know, you never take it for granted when you're exposing, you know, you're exposing your survivors to the media. But what are some of the, you know, what are some of the concerns you have, Afra, when you are opening up your clients to media interviews?
I think it's quite a lot that's what has been mentioned. It's definitely is, and I think a lot of our clients or the survivor that we work with, they do want to speak out, they want to participate, but they don't want to be identified. And quite a lot of the time, the media, what we go back to them and we kind of say, okay, we will give you a story, we will give you a voice, but the client cannot be identified. And quite a lot of the time that get disregarded. And I think that's a lot of sometimes our clients like, well, why would I put my client in there? Why would you want to see a face that it's making it so sad? And making, you know, that image in a really negative. And I think it's quite a lot of the time it's in these issues betrayed. I know they're really complex, and they're really you know, the abuse that they go through. But I think sometimes it's that how it's written or how to kind of reward it, rather than actually talking about the issue, not about the how the community or the culture is. And so, and I think it's really, really important of the language is used when you write an article, and how the clients, the survivors' views are kind of written to the language that they have both, rather than somebody kind of interpreting it in a different ways. I think those, and I think it's the stereotype. I think as we all kind of talk about it, it's sometimes they feel that they're betraying their culture, and it's not about betraying their culture. They're speaking about these issues that are trying to break that kind of harmful identified. But as we also, and they feel that they're not understood. So why would they go and talk to a journalist when no matter what I say, it doesn't feel that I've understood? And then the most importantly that we always kind of base it's that it brings a lot of trauma sometimes to our clients after following. So we have to really, when we want our survivor to, we really want to kind of a lot of the time kind of reassure them of what's going to happen. They want that step-by-step guidance, what exactly going to happen from the minute they get involved to the minute that they finish and after they finish. And that is so important for us when we want a survivor to really speak. We want to really build those confidence to a point where they are able to identify, they want to identify themselves, but many of them just don't want that. They don't want to be faced in it. They just want to tell their story, but they don't need to be showing to the world this is who it is.
But we need that step-by-step guides as well. You know, in the media industry, I think we need to be told, you know, I think a guide in terms of what the person is comfortable talking about, or what their triggers might be, or I think there's a lot, because, you know, when you're getting trained as a journalist, I mean, I graduated back in 2001. and we wanted emotions, we wanted people to cry. That was our thing. If you could get someone to cry on TV or on radio, then you've done your job, because emotions are fantastic. It's as time goes along, you realize that actually, no, these are people's real feelings. Yeah, because once we've done with our story and we've got the, well done for that interview, in my head now is what's happened to that person, because now they've relived that trauma. So I think having this this guideline is really important for lots of media professionals, because as Maya said before, we are not all the same. We all come with our own learning and our own experiences, and that's how we handle our news stories. So if you're coming out from a hard news journalist, point of view, you're not really bothered about the survivor. You just want the story. You want to look good. It's more of an ego. So this media guide is so important. Maya, do you want to add
Nikki,
anything to that? Oh, sorry, Sally.
Yeah. So just to come in again, I think, it's extremely important, because I think a lot of survivors at times are pressured, into giving, like, whether it's their name or their face, and that is absolutely not okay, because it's not the person or the face, it's the story. It is, but it's the story and how we put that forward. That is the most important. But on the opposite side of that, I think we should get given a choice. So in my kind of situation, I have in the past been told by journalists that, we will publish your story as long as we change your name and we don't put your face on it. And I said, no, because this is my story. This is who I am. I want to be identified, because, to me, this is a big part of my campaigning work, is a big part. Again, it goes back to the collusion with the perpetrator and the fear of being sued and things like that. And that is absolutely also not acceptable. So yeah, I think we should be given a choice, and where survivors, whether they want to remain anonymous or not, that should not have an impact on how they're supported and kind of the aftercare that we've referred to as well.
And you know what, it's so hard, because sometimes, again, like Maya said, sometimes as journalists, it's not the final decision is with the editor. So if we say, actually the survivor said they want to be named, full name, then the editor will say, well, actually, we've done the training and safeguarding says we can't name them, or we can just use the first name. So sometimes it doesn't even lie, the last decision doesn't even lie with us, which can be quite annoying. So it's a complicated one. But Maya, do you want to add to that?
And also, the lawyers that work for papers, they have, the final say is with the editor. It'll be an editorial decision, but the lawyers get, every story gets legal. Is it legal? Okay. Is it not? So journalists, they're just one cog in a wider machine. But yeah, I think, from a survivor's perspective, the media, just how it's kind of structured, isn't very survivor friendly, because it's like, you're, especially with papers, this is more so with papers, because things get killed, things get cut, and this is your life, that you've gone and given to a journalist bravely, and then it disappears from sight. So I just think there is something inherently, and this wouldn't have to be the case, but it's the way that the media is organized, in the world that we live in. There's a inherent disconnect between journalism and, the interests of the survivor. Also, interviewing someone, asking someone questions, asking uncomfortable questions, that would be, like a key tenet of journalism. But then, asking a politician an uncomfortable question is different to asking a survivor an uncomfortable question, isn't it? Morally. But then again, from a journalistic perspective, there's sometimes editors want you to answer certain questions, and you have to, ask difficult questions. But, an interview is inherently a re-traumatizing experience. I would always ask, say at the beginning, you don't have to answer anything you don't want to. If you need to stop because you're upset, let me know. But yeah, it's all quite tricky territory.
I was going to ask you, actually, Maya, because having straddled both worlds, like I was of the you can do a read back world when I used to do true life stories. But do you think it's useful? Because having switched over to the comms side and sort of helping journalists find their survivors to speak to and preparing both sides, do you find it, or do you think generally journalists would find it helpful if we sort of draw the boundaries in advance and make it clear that these are the topics? For example, there are some things that this survivor will happy to talk about all of these things, but this thing, they're not going to talk about that. Do you find that useful, or because it can feel like you're being a blocker when actually, unlike if it's a politician, you're actually doing it to protect the individual, not to hide anything? Is that useful, or is that something?
I think that can be helpful, you know, if there's a specific thing, you know, and you just say, please don't ask them about that, and that's really helpful. But then again, journalists are overworked massively, you know, and that isn't their fault. And that isn't even, you know, that's not even the editor's fault. That is just, you know, these are, you know, structural things. You know, we're all flawed humans living in wider structures. But I think that that can be helpful. But also you don't want, you know, it's nice to develop your own relationship with your interviewee rather than just be, you know, having someone kind of like intervening too much. So I think there's a balance.
Yeah. Final question, because we only have about 5 minutes. So what one practice, do we have any questions from the audience? Even if it's one each. Actually, no. Yeah, any questions? Because we're just talking away here.
I'll keep an eye on the question and answer box, and I'll shout if any pop in if you want to start the question you're about to ask.
I was thinking, so can we define one practical step that can be taken to ensure better, more accurate representation of harmful practices, survivors and affected communities? What can we do in the media? One practice. What if you had your time again, for example, Katra, that you could have asked a journalist to how to behave? What practical step would you put forward?
Hi, it's a good question, actually. I think for me, it's a balance in the story, you know, because, yeah, majority of FGM is within a certain community, but also highlighting for me, you know, that there are Christian groups that actually do this is important. Also, you know, historically, in the UK, they used to practice clitorectomies for women that were neurotic. They they were neurotic because of their ovaries, because of their clitoris, and that would be removed. So, you know, it was a practice that happened here. So having those references in there, you know, in a Western society, we practice clitorectomies and FGM, and just getting that balance. You know, why have we come forward in a Western society? You know, what's allowed us to move away from that practice, and just having the evidence as well. You know, not being so personal in their questioning, and for the journalists to have their own research about harmful practices, about FGM, have some level of understanding before you come in and start interviewing.
Fab. And it's interesting you say that. I wrote a piece about skin bleaching, but actually I went all the way back to the history of skin bleaching, and actually it started with Western, you know, with the West, and then it came to places like they actually brought it to Africa and the Caribbean and Asia, you know, and colorism. But I had to take it back because everyone kept on talking about skin bleaching like it was you know, an ethnic minority problem, but actually it was brought to us by the West, you know, so it's important that there's a balance in there and some historical context as well. Yeah. Totally agree. Zulika, the same question.
I think basically it's changing the representation and changing the stereotype story, and giving out the more balanced version of the story would be much more helpful, and that's mainly my main points. I would feel the main thing is change the representation It's got to change.
Yeah. Salia?
So I think for me, it's around listening to the survivor, listening to their authentic story and publishing it, and actually publishing the story despite any kind of repercussions that the journalists might perceive, because it is those stories, and that actually takes a lot of courage, and it is those journalists that I have the most respect for.
I don't know whether to ask you, Maya, because we're in it.
What it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because in all walks of life, you've got some people who have more empathy than others, and some people with more emotional intelligence. We're not going to suddenly, turn all journalists into very sensitive, emotionally intelligent people. Sadly, in the same way, we're not going to turn, every politician. So, but I think that yeah, there's probably structural things that need to change within the media as a whole. There's such an emphasis on fast turnaround now that we work, online, digital environment, 24/7 media. So that would probably, give journalists a bit more time. So they've got a bit more time to do a more leisurely interview. Well, not leisurely might not be the right word in this context, but, take longer to look after their sources, because sometimes it's not their own fault. They've just been given way too much work to do. And then that's not the editor's fault for giving them too much work to do. It's, we exist in a climate where the media is highly competitive, and, traffic, the numbers that stories get, selling headlines. So I think, it's not always the individual journalist's fault. It's wider systemic structural issues. But I think, so what you asked me, what we could change, I think, people need to have more awareness of honour-based abuse and not go into interviews, plagued with ignorance. But, Islamophobia is rife in society. It's also, the media is a reflection of issues within society, but then it's a two-way thing. Then it also kind of exacerbates, bigotry and prejudice in society by amplifying those views. So it's, it's representing those views and then representing them back.
Fab. Afra, this question might be actually more for you. So Farida says, thank you so much for organising such a wonderful education and informative session. I'd like to ask, why do we not have any male panelists? Are they not interested or ignorant? Thanks.
Thanks, Farida. And I think with most the invite people that we have, there are survivor ambassadors, and we didn't really thought of that. That's a question that we can take away and think about it for next time. Definitely, it wasn't specifically we didn't have or anything. Normally we have our patron Nazir Afzal, and stuff, but so we just thought it's really important to give the survivor the platform to hear and share their experience, rather than having so it just happened to be they're all female. That's the reason. So there isn't any particular reason.
So Ashley says, should Savera UK try and place these stories in newspapers? So, I know The Guardian, I think The Guardian up north, actually most newspapers have a kind of a citizen page. Would that be something you would consider in terms of writing your own story and seeing if they will publish it?
I feel like I should probably chip in here, given this the kind of what I do alongside Lauren with Savera. So we do, I mean, obviously Cathra's story and Salia's have been out there already, and we're working with, obviously Zuleika's only just sort of come into that point where she's talking about her story, and also our survivors. We do, and we often try, and we sort of work with journalists, and we do hit stumbling blocks, which I haven't had the experience myself. I do often understand. We might have a story, but they absolutely need to be identified, and because it isn't a photo with that story, they go on, we're sorry, we can't do it. So yes, we should be trying to place those stories, and it's definitely something we're working on, and we're actually working in creating sort of a survivor advocacy board where survivors who want to speak out can do so, but we give them the support and training, because sometimes maybe I think when we think about this, you know, when you think about the aftercare with journalists, does a journalist have, you know, the time to give aftercare? Well, if not working with an organisation like Savera, we can give that aftercare. The journalist can work with us to know that we will give that aftercare, and that we will do the check-in, and that we will, you know, check in and see when the article is going to be published, so it's not a big shock when it appears. And I think we have to do, except with my journalist hat on, I think all these stories are amazing and should be out there. And a lot of the survivors that we work with who aren't here today, our clients, they've got amazing stories, and they're so powerful when you speak to them about them. But we have to think about them. And sometimes we have to say, oh, it's probably not a good idea for you to talk about this because X, Y, and Z. It's helping them to do it in the right way. So yes, we need to do it, and we're working on those methods and approaches of doing it. And these guidelines will in part be that, because I think they're important, but we do have to always do it with the survivor in mind and looking after them and be the support for them.
I like this one. So what role can male allies play? Afra, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, to us, it doesn't really matter if
it's a man that's asked that question. So it's a male that's asked that question. So
to me, it doesn't really matter what gender they are, as long as we work together. But it's definitely from the representative of male, as the question today asked, is definitely the more we work with them, and for them to champion this area of work, because a lot of the time people think these areas is more a female's issue and male should not part of it. Everybody play a huge role, and the more we all work together and stand against those horrific practices and speak out, the more hopefully that stereo and that silence will break, and then people wouldn't have that fear of coming forward to be able to tell their story, but also most importantly escape the abusive environment and be there. So anybody within communities, that male or female or all whatever age group or how they identify themselves as, is the more we speak and break the silence, the more we hopefully change the attitude and behavior toward those. So, yeah.
Got another question. Would it be possible for Savera to release stats locally in the media so that the general public can begin to understand the prevalence of these issues?
I'll answer for this one as well. We do. We actually have an impact report every year that we share, which has the information about what we do and what the work that we do. So that covers that side of things. And quite often we do around sort of key dates such as the Day of Memory, the Day of Zero Tolerance for FGM. We will work with, for example, our partners at Merseyside Police, the PCC, Cheshire Police, people like that, to get those relevant statistics and share them. So we do that, and we do sort of try and highlight the regional scale of the problem, because it's a hidden issue, and I think Afra will probably be able to go a little bit more into detail than me in this. The numbers sometimes can appear very small, and we have to be very careful about how we report them. But we know it's only this is always only the tip of the iceberg. So, Afra, in terms of reporting stats, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think that's what sometimes people think, that, you know, oh, they're only like a handful of numbers that came. When we started this work, there was no record of those issues 10 years ago. Nobody even it was all under domestic abuse. The issues considered never really mentioned. So we have come quite a long way. But we're still very at the beginning as well. So when people think that we see 100 women or 140 women a year, that no, sorry, I shouldn't say women. It's across actually across male and female and all those affected by honor-based abuse, regardless of gender. That we have people think, oh, it's a small percentage. That small percentage to us is a huge because of the silence of the practice, because of people not able to come forward and speak, but also mostly is because when they go and ask for help, these issues are not being recognized and people identify it as domestic abuse. So we have so many times where we'll sit in safeguarding meetings and people think, oh, it's domestic abuse, but when we sit there, there is an identified as honor-based abuse, and then they refer to us. So there is a lot of education for services to really be able to recognize those issues when to ask for help and support. So yeah, so it's not because they're not, some of them not reported, but quite a high percentage of them is not being recognized as honor-based abuse. And that's a huge issue.
So do you think politicians, so this is from Alice, says, do you think politicians have a greater role to play in speaking out on
definitely. Yeah. Because the more they champion this area of work, the more people will be able to listen, the more people will be able to hear. Those are people who are of decision makers, those people who really go out there into the public and speak. So when they champion these kind of work, hopefully people within across cultures, they will know that people really actually recognize those issues, understand those issues, and people really kind of to start doing something. What we want to do is, I don't want Savera to be existence, because anybody who are at risk or at safeguarding should be able to use the same services as anyone else, and it should be provided with all the support as they are. But sadly, that is why Savera exists, is because the generic services are still lacking that specialist support and specialist understanding and dealing with these with those at risk of those kind of issues in a very I don't know, it's kind of it's them and us, and it shouldn't be that.
So we've got an anonymous, but this isn't a question. They said they felt that this was such an empowering session. Thank you all very much.
Oh,
I love that. I love that. And I think, do we have any more questions? No? So big thank you. It's always enlightening, and it's nice to hear from so many different voices as well. Apologies we don't have a male this time round, but normally we do. So this is Setting the Story Straight event, and as I mentioned earlier on, if you do have a question that you didn't feel comfortable asking today, Savera is on hand to answer your questions later on. And yeah, so thank you for all our panelists. Thank you to Rachel, Nikki, Lauren. Thank you for organising, and yeah, see you all very soon.
Thanks for chairing, Gunan.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.